Our featured speaker of the evening, which is Rick Harnish, Executive Director of the Midwest High-Speed Rail Association. Rick is the Executive Director of one of the nation's oldest and largest high-speed rail advocacy organizations based in Chicago. He co-founded it in 1993, became its first Executive Director in 2001. And if you've read any of the trade magazines and seen any articles and postings, he's quoted in opinion pieces and articles quite frequently in Midwest and Illinois media, and regularly speaks around the country on high-speed rail and railroad infrastructure issues. Rick sits on the Civic Advisory Committee for the Chicago Union Station Master Plan Study and a member of Governor Quinn's Advisory Committee to the Illinois Department of Transportation on a feasibility study on a 220-mile-an-hour high-speed corridor from Chicago to Champaign-Urbana. And by the way, if you want more details about our presenters tomorrow, all the information is posted online, and you'll be able to see that at texasrailadvocates.org. So without any further ado, please welcome Rick Harnish, my friend.
Thank you, Peter. So, can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, or do I need the microphone? Anybody need the microphone? Microphone helps, okay. So, I started this, that's fine. So Peter asked me to talk about what we're doing in Illinois to move passenger rail forward, talk about some of our successes, some of the methods that we use to get there. So it might seem like I'm talking about our group a little bit too much, I don't know, but hopefully I can spread some examples of what has been working and talk about my current goals in order to get us closer to something really exciting. I, as a, let's say 5 to 6, 7-year-old kid, really loved taking the rapid transit from Lakewood, Ohio to downtown Cleveland. And I don't know if you haven't been to Cleveland, there's this thing called Tower City is what they call it now. But it was this massive TOD project that was put together in the 20s by a couple of recluses called the Van Sweringen brothers. And they in this one block built a steam railroad station that was actually electrified, that would have been, if all that infrastructure was still there, you would just upgrade it and it'd be ready for high-speed trains. They had a place for interurbans to bring people in from the local communities and out in the country into the city. They had a place to put a subway station. They had a place for streetcars. And then above all of that, there was a high-end office tower, a high-end department store, a high-end hotel, a big office block, a post office, all in one big, what we now call TOD facility. And they actually came at it backwards because it started with a real estate deal in the suburbs, which is now called Shaker Heights. And then they just kept building us up. And I loved going downtown. And I'd come up out of the subway station into this beautiful grand hall, and there were people there, but then you go out onto the street, and you go down to the Woolworths, and you'd sit at the counter and get a drink at the counter. And the place was so vibrant, and there were 2 department stores downtown, and I just loved that. And part of that was taking the train, and part of the reason that vibrancy was there was because it was next to the railroad station, right? And that real estate development wouldn't have worked if it wasn't for that railroad station. And going downtown, I would see them pulling tracks up, right? You could see where the wires used to be for the electric locomotives. They were closing off the stairways down to the platforms because they didn't need all 6 or 7 platforms, they just needed 1 or 2. And I kept asking my dad, why is this happening? Why don't we have more trains? and he didn't really have an answer. And then I remember back on, and it's an obvious why I remember the date, April 30th, 1971, sitting at a grade crossing in Lakewood, and my dad saying there will never be a train coming to Cleveland ever again, right? And that really made me upset. Like, how can that be? How can we not have trains anymore? And for those who don't know, Amtrak started the next day. And in order to save the village, we burned it down almost. And we left a little bit of rubble, but, you know, we lost like, I don't know, 3/4 of our trains overnight. So I spent my life trying to figure out what it was going to take to get people back on trains. And I thought that the way to get there was to figure out how to run a company that would run trains. And I got a degree in transportation management, spent time in logistics, understanding how that worked, and came to the conclusion in the late 90s, what was missing was an advocacy organization. An organization that could speak for the people who really wanted high-speed rail and could talk more openly than vendors could or governments can and get to some of those solutions. So we figured out how to get that money put together in 2001, and I started immediately upon George Bush taking office, which was not very good timing from that perspective. But the thing that I did was I said, okay, people really want trains. And you know how I knew that? Because I've come into these towns all throughout Illinois, and this is a key thing. You've got to have somebody, at least one person, hopefully a number of people, who are saying the same thing, who can go and do lots of events and talk to face-to-face with people, because things happen differently when you're face-to-face. That's why we're here. We're here because things are different when you're together. We could do this by a webcast, right? And that would be boring, and you'd probably be distracted, and you wouldn't have had the enjoyment of sitting down over a meal with people. Which, by the way, is why trains are so important, is because they bring people together. But I would do these presentations, and I'd have these sales pitches on why we should have great train service, and at the end of it, people would say, how do you think this would work? Amtrak can't keep the bathrooms clean. Or how do you think this will work? The train's never on time. Whoa. Wait a minute. Obviously, these people are already riding the train because you don't know the bathroom's dirty if you're not on the train. So it became a process of saying, well, what could we do to help them get what they want? And what they want is a clean bathroom. What they want is a train that gets to downtown before 9 a.m. What they want is a train that's actually there on time. And we put together a program, and I coordinated with lots of experts to figure out a program where the state in 1 year could do something dramatic. And a coalition built around that. The Environmental Law Policy Center put a lot of effort into staff time and coordinating and connecting the right kind of environmental people together, the elected officials. Joe Szabo, who then was the legislative director for the UTU in Illinois, brought his heavy guns to bear in getting the legislature on board, and we continued our grassroots efforts. And after 2 years of this campaign, we got Illinois to double Amtrak service. And we did that by coming up with a proposal. And that proposal changed, and it wasn't quite what we proposed at the beginning when it happened at the end, but by coming up with a proposal, we were able to then have a concrete discussion about how we move forward. That led to then we got nearly $1.5 billion. I haven't added it up in a while, but it's about $1.5 billion in passenger rail infrastructure out of the stimulus. At that time, there was a guy named Obama who happened to be in the state legislature. There was a congressman called Emanuel. And one of the things we have to do is we have to be ready, because we don't know when things are going to happen. And you have to have the right proposal at the right time when that thing happens, and you have no clue when it's going to happen, right? In 2008, unfortunately, it was a tragic accident. In 2001, it was 9/11. And Rahm Emanuel was in office as a congressman, and he sat down after that for kind of a debrief over the transportation implications of that. And he said, you know what, if this ever happens again, this is what I'm going to do. People are going to want things, and we're going to talk about what everybody else wants. And at the 11th hour and the 59th minute, we're going to say, we want high-speed rail, right? And if I'm ever in this position, that's what I'm going to do. And I don't know if you remember in 2009, the way I remember it is I went to bed thinking we might get $200 million in high-speed rail money, right? And that's not really that much, but boy, that's a lot more than we've gotten in a long time. And I remember going back, remember they had newspapers? I went out to the stoop, I got my newspaper, I opened it up, and it said $8 billion for high-speed rail. And that's because the right guy was in the right place with the right plan at the right time, and his name was Rahm Emanuel. Now he's my mayor. So it's a really complicated thing that you've got to do, but it really comes down to lots of talking to people face to face. And the tools that we have electronically help you get there and make those, but really when it comes down to it, it's face-to-face connections, and it's a lot of talking to people, and it's a lot of back and forth and helping other people get what they want, not what you want, really. It's what the other people want, the people with power. So we've been working on a presentation that I've modified dramatically to try to make these points as we go. Hopefully this will be helpful in the discussion, and feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a burning question. I was in Ciudad Real this November for the 25th anniversary of high-speed rail between Chicago and Seville. And there you see a Talgo high-speed train pulling into Ciudad Real to take me back downtown where I could get a hotel to get to the airport. That was 25 years ago that this started, and we still don't have a high-speed train. That's very frustrating to me. One of the interesting things here is, this is like if you were to have a presentation down at College Station, Texas, if you're going to have your conference there and people stayed at hotels in Dallas, right? That's what this was. About a quarter of the people attending this conference that I was at actually had hotels in Madrid, and they took the train back and forth every day. That was a really neat trip. So one of the things I hear a lot as I'm out traveling or talking to people is, why can't we have trains like they have in Europe, right? And you hear lots of excuses. Some of them have some truth and some don't. One thing is, Europe is so much smaller than the U.S. Well, we've got really stupid zoning in the U.S., but we're not that much. We've got the same number of people over the same geographic area. It's just we've got stupid zoning, and you have to drive to get a glass of milk, right? And there's other reasons. But when it really comes down to it, people are right. And this is why. This is a train from Berlin to Frankfurt. And look what people are doing. They're working, they're sleeping, they're eating. One thing they have on high-speed trains in Germany that's unique is they actually have diners where you can sit down and have a real meal in a diner. That's around the corner there. We should have that. And I would do it if it was a 5 or 6 hour trip from Dallas to Chicago, right? What you don't see here is the security lines. You don't see the weather delays, all of that. And one thing, these guys, and I guess there's this, what's this one? Right? These guys here, at the beginning of the trip, look, they're a little red-faced and they've got really big steins of beer. At the end of the trip, they've got what I think were different steins, and they're really red-faced, and they're really angry at me for taking a picture. But this is why people want it. But I also believe it's not just the trains. What people are saying is they want the vibrant communities that happen. So when you get off that train in Frankfurt, and you're at this beautiful station with the things that you want walking distance from that station. And we have to figure out a way to better convey that to folks as we're going along. So how do we get this? And there's 6 things we have to make this work. And there's one of these that people don't think about very often, right? And I worked on this for a couple of good days to really try to narrow it down to a simple format for those who aren't familiar with the planning process. But everybody starts with funding. We have to have funding, right? Well, One thing that they taught me in sales training class, and I sold copiers for 2 years because I figured this is going to be a really hard sales job to get people to buy the concept of high-speed trains. One thing they told us was they'll always say there's no money, I can't afford it until the day they decide they want. In Europe really isn't actionable. You can just say, yeah, I agree with you, and then you're done, right, if you're the congressman. So you have to have a plan. And you have to have a plan that's implementable, and again, it has to be implementable on a flash. So we had resources all of a sudden show up out of nowhere in 2009 and no real plans. I'm really glad that Joe Szabo is really focused on setting up the next round of plans so the next time there is funding. And the fact that you've done this work on the I-35 corridor is critically important in that process. But in order to have a plan, you have to have an agency that has funding to have staff to actually design the plan. And here's the one that people don't think of. You have to have a railroad, right? And that doesn't mean the tracks in this case. A railroad is two different things. It's infrastructure, but it's also an institutional structure that is very different from other types of corporations. And people forget that. And so it's really critical that you have a railroad that's on board. And right now, what's the railroad's deal in passengers? And I don't know this for a fact. Nobody will tell me, but I've kind of pieced it together. Amtrak today pays $5 a train mile. The railroads aren't willing to talk to you about running a train if you don't have $60 a train mile, right? So how are we going to get the railroads on board at that type of deal? A critical thing we have to figure out is how the railroads can make money at this. And that goes back to funding and having the funding so this all ties together. But the challenge is you can't work around the circle. You have to do all six at once because they all interact with each other all together. So what can we do on the outside? We can put together a proposal. It's not the proposal that's going to be done. We know that it's going to change a lot as the process goes through. But by asking questions around developing this proposal, you go to each of these agents, each of these groups, and you say, what do you think about this? Oh, you don't like that? What do you think about this? What do you think about this? And by doing that, you influence all six at once. And so our goal this year is to raise $1 million in order to put together a proposal to show the states of Illinois, hopefully Indiana, we need a little bit more if we're going to do Wisconsin, how they could actually build a high-speed line. And I'll talk more about why that's so critical later. So let's go, so looking at that big constituency, what are the constituencies? They all want something different. And one of the things I've noticed over the last several years is that we look at one piece of the puzzle, piece by piece by piece by piece. So some people are really interested in business travel. Some people are really interested in just going to see their family. Some people are interested in commuter rail. Some people are interested in high-speed rail. Some people are interested in getting on an overnight trip without having to get in one of those horrible things that goes up in the air, right? But we don't look at them together in a package. And what do trains do differently than all of the other modes? They carry a lot of people efficiently. A plane is not that big, right? A 737 has like 140 seats. It's a couple of bus loads. A train can hold 1,000 people, 1,100 people. And if you're really willing to cram them in, you can get up to 1,500, 2,000 people if you really want to cram them in, right? So you have to bring together a lot of different people in order to make trains work. So you need a plan that serves all of these different interests. And again, we've categorized them in 6. Of course, you can split them down. But you take existing riders. And one of the things I've noticed is people think about existing riders, and they talk to them, they say, I just want the train to be more dependable, or maybe I want one more train, right? Great, but that's not going to get you over the political hump. The potential riders that aren't using the train right now, they probably want something that's close to driving. But you really have to go really fast to be close to driving, despite the myth that's in the rail advocacy community. I'll talk to that in a minute. The communities, they want access, and they want to have their cake and eat it too. So they want to be able to get on a train easily, but they don't want to have to close grade crossings in order to have that train, right? Heavy hitters, the big guys who actually can go to luncheons and spend, or dinners and spend $3,000 a plate in order to schmooze up to the people who actually write the checks, they want 2.5 hours or less. And that's consistent, 2.5 hours or less. And there's magic about that around a day and out in one day and other things. And that's the point where you start to get aggravated on a train or an airplane. And the construction firms, again, the people who are writing big checks, they want big projects. And one of the things we've missed is who is actually going to make money building high-speed rail, and how do we get them to tell Congress to grab money out of people's pockets to pay them, right? We figured out how to do it on the highway system. So the feds put in a little bit money. The highway contractors make a lot of money. The car companies make a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Who pays for all of that? You do when you go to a store and you have to pay more for your goods because that person has to have a parking lot in order to have you come, right? Or you go to work and your salary is lower because that company has to pay for a parking lot in order to have you come to work, right? So we've figured out how to take things from different places and make some people rich. We've got to figure out how to do that in high-speed rail. And then the last is railroads. And again, we've really blown it as advocates on this one. 110 miles an hour is too fast to be compatible with heavy haul trains. And we will not get to a point where we can talk about a business relationship with the railroads as long as we continue to talk about 110 mile an hour trains. We need to get less than that and talk about super dependable high frequency service where the railroads make money at it. And those are basically what this plan, the constituencies that this plan has to address. And we have to address it in these success factors. And all of these are impacted by speed. You can't have good amenities if you don't have a lot of people in the station. You can only get a lot of people on the trains in the station with speed. Frequency, the faster the train is, the more a crew can go back and forth in a day, right? Location, I'll talk about that in a minute. Price, you've got to drive down the cost. That means a lot of people on the train. That means speed. And reliability fits into those altogether. And here's why speed is so important for being auto-competitive. And this is another one of these little pieces that just kind of clicked over the last year. If you have to drive to your station and it takes 4 hours to get from downtown to downtown, or take a bus or a taxi or whatever, that little circle at the top is how big the potential market is to ride that train. And remember, our cities are spread out because we've got really stupid zoning. So you've got to be able to make it worth somebody getting to the train station and then from the train station to the other end. So even though, like in my town, in my part of the world, rail advocates talk about 4 hours is auto-competitive, Chicago to St. Louis, it isn't, because it doesn't get you out to the suburbs. And so you've got to be 2 hours, 2.5 hours even to be auto-competitive. And we've seen this over and over and over again. We use this example because there were 5 trains a day, 5.5 hours, Chicago or Madrid to Seville. That's what we have on Amtrak today. Not only did they completely flip the market share, they grew the market tremendously by the process of running faster trains. So one of the things that we need to have in this plan is different services for different people. And the one that's going to drive the agenda is the high-speed trains. I've talked about why. This is in Florence over this summer. And Italy has been building their network piece by piece by piece by piece. Now they've stretched from Milan down to Naples. And they're continuing out, right? They're currently designing the tunnel to get rid of this stub end station so the high-speed trains can just go straight through. They're doing it piece by piece, and we need to think about it piece by piece, at least in my part of the world. I think it's probably different on Dallas to Houston, but we don't have that kind of market pair up in our part of the world. So we've got to figure out how to have one piece of track that serves a lot of different cities. which means you've got to do a piece someplace that has a lot of feeders into it. Got to have local trains that serve the local communities that feed into the high-speed train stations well. You need to have airport service and preferably a mix of trains. So this is the Rome airport. On the left there is a high-speed train that's come in from Venice to Rome. In the middle is an express train from downtown Rome into the airport. And you can't see it behind that train, but there's a commuter train from the suburbs. My mayor is really focused on how we get a express train from downtown to the airport. We're trying to persuade him that he really needs to think bigger for a lot of reasons. And of course, it's got to work well with transit. And all of these things then work together to do the most critical piece, right? Which is bringing people face to face more frequently, more often, and doing it so that people can stay in place and have jobs over here, and they can be more flexible in work, and attract different kinds of companies and all of that. And so we've started working on diagrams to help folks understand how this works together, so they can start to think bigger than just that service that they want, and explain how. So today you've got a couple of these connections, and you can start to add to it, but that high-speed line in the middle really ties it all together and brings it together. The other thing that happens if you think about networks instead of city pairs is like Chicago to Indianapolis. That's a great place to start high-speed rail. 180 miles an hour, it's dumb to fly. I-65 is incredibly dangerous. It's too long to drive. And Chicago charges you $40 a day to park your 2-ton briefcase if you have to bring it with you. But if you did, say, this high-speed network, you've only got 3 opportunities for somebody to use that train. Now, this is the way our current planning structure would look at this. And they would come to the conclusion that it doesn't work for 2 reasons. One, it doesn't really serve enough of Indiana to be politically interesting. The other is, it's really hard to justify the infrastructure just for that piece. And you would say, well, you know what? With this market, we could get away with something else, right? So what we really have to do is look at it as a whole picture. So there is a group trying to get commuter rail from Muncie to Indianapolis, and it doesn't work on its own. But if you had also the ability to go from Muncie to Chicago, you've got a lot more people in there, right? And it's true with each of these. So we need to be able to look at it as a whole picture instead of just segments by segments. And this is out of order, I apologize. And you know what a high-speed line is, right? So you've got no grade crossings there. You see the bridge over the highway, separate freight tracks, electrified, and fences to keep people off the track. So if you remember the interstate highway maps, we used to have to buy a new interstate highway map every year because they kept adding segments of the highway system, right? You have to do that with the European high-speed rail system as well. They keep adding segments of high-speed line. And this is how big it is. And remember, if you have high-speed rail. And we laid that, we had to do some twisting, but if you lay that over the U.S., again, I think we're going to twist this to show that the China system actually covers everything east of the Mississippi. But look what happens if you stretch out the Japanese system. It goes from Boston to Orlando. Again, remember, we are way too far apart to have high-speed rail. So we've done it before with the interstate highway system, and this was tough. It was really hard to figure out how to pay for the interstate highway system because they couldn't figure out how to justify raising the tax in order to do it. They couldn't figure out the politics of how do you get money? Where's all the power in highway building? At that time, it was all in the counties, right? So you couldn't take power away from the counties in order to build the interstate highway system. They had to figure out a structure that made that work, right? But we ended up creating a structure that makes a lot of sense, or it made a lot of sense. It doesn't make any sense anymore. But it's really smooth. This is the policy side, which is somewhat similar to the funding side. Look, you just go from the top to the bottom. Whatever your use is at the bottom, it goes through the Federal Highway Administration if you're using federal funds. Doesn't matter And remember, most highways have trucks, small cars, big cars, RVs, all of that. People going to work, people just going to a party, all of that on one thing. But remember what we need to do is figure out how to get a big plan that shows how pieces work as a big plan so you can start figuring out which pieces start first and how you can justify big investments in one place in order to solve a lot of problems, right? This is the policy structure for railroads. Simplified. And this is based on usage, not infrastructure. So you can have, theoretically, we don't have high-speed trains today really, but theoretically, you could have a high-speed train in sections sharing track with a freight train, sharing track with a train that gets people to work every day, and a train that goes between cities, right? And there's one big category missing in here. People who just want to make a trip during the middle of the day, there isn't really a category for that. There's a category for people who want to go to work, but there isn't a category for people throughout the day. But that's a mess. And what we're trying to do is show how to get through this mess state by state. And we're going to start by showing how Illinois could coordinate this. And what they did with that county problem and the state problem at the highway level, which I don't think is going to replicate because we're not as rich as we once were, but the feds gave 90% for an interstate highway system. And all you had to do for that 90% was follow their rules, right? And basically the feds paid for it, but then the states could give the money to the counties on a coordinated state plan, and so the guys making money at the county level laying asphalt still were the guys making money, right? We got to figure that structure out, and the first step is understanding what the network looks like. So California is the furthest along on this, and I have to remind you they are actually under construction. It's been challenging. One of the problems, or one of the challenges is nobody really believed it would actually happen, I think. And so there were decisions that were made that you didn't really think through, right? And one of them was they're rebuilding or have been rebuilding Highway 99, which parallels this, replacing all of the bridges. Now, if they had coordinated with the highway department, they could have made the bridges wider and then just run the high-speed train along 99, right? And some other things like that that ended up with a little bit more expense. The other thing was because they had money, but they weren't quite along and they hadn't acquired the land, and this came out a lot more in the last day or two. They hadn't acquired the land, so they had to start construction without owning the land, and you always get screwed when that happens, right? So it's under construction. But remember, they started in 1990 with a bonding program that allowed them to build commuter rail systems from scratch. And there's Metrolink that didn't exist in 1990 that is one of the biggest commuter rail systems. They vastly expanded Amtrak service. And there's a surfliner at Oceanside, and we stopped there. That's my son in the green shirt. We stopped there to look at one of their feeder lines at Oceanside. And if I can have a personal agenda here for a minute, I've never really liked bilevels. This sold it for me. I was tired. I was jet lagged. We had been doing a lot of hiking around the day before. We got up early, went and saw a museum in San Diego. I've got my suitcase. He's got his suitcase. We get into that door. I walk up to the stairs, right? I get to the top of the stairs. I put my luggage in, and I'm like, where's Zach? And he's standing at the bottom of the stairs. He can't carry his luggage up the stairs. Stairs in trains is a dumb idea. And so I was really glad in the Midwest when we decided to switch from bilevels to single levels. Buses are critical in this because we can't build trains everywhere. You have to have a lot of buses feeding in, and their coordinated system leads the way. Today, this doesn't work well together, right? And California High-Speed Rail Authority was kind of off on its own. And so it hasn't been working as well as it could. But the high-speed line is tying these things together in a way you wouldn't have anticipated, not only physically and market-wise, but politically. And so what they've done, and Jerry Brown has been leading this, is saying, what would happen if we coordinated this? Let's have a master plan for everything. And Chad Edison has done a fantastic job of creating that statewide vision where everything works together with timed connections, hourly headways on the biggest routes, so that you know you can catch this hourly train, and at that station you can connect to that hourly train or that hourly bus, sometimes more frequent, on other routes less frequent, but always on a pulse at the station so that you can connect in that network, right? And figuring out where those pieces are, where you can do piece by piece and have everybody involved. And this is really exciting. And if you think about it that way, and if you know where the mountain ranges are, building the first high-speed line in the middle of the Central Valley was genius. And look what happens at the north end. See all of these things up there that are in yellow? Most of them already exist, and they could use a real big boost in ridership. With that high-speed line, you have now brought the part of the state hours closer to that, so now you can have a feeder network to that high-speed line at Merced. And you don't really have to get the high-speed trains all the way into San Francisco or even San Jose in order to make the service useful. You need a train that has bogies that are flexible enough to run on really bad freight track and stiff enough to run at 220 miles an hour. You need to figure out how to deal with the electrification versus diesel. There is a train in the world that has that, and I'll let Josh tell you what train that is. It operates in Spain, and it has the word Taugo on the side. This is how you really start to make everything work well. And what we want to do in Illinois is show how Illinois can replicate this. So you've got the funnel kind of feeding into the main trunk at the north, and you've got a similar occurrence down at the end. And even if you have to have a bus bridge between Burbank and Bakersfield because of the Tehachapi Mountains, you're still way better off taking a bus and getting up to San Francisco that way. The other thing is, because of that process that I talked about earlier, where you have to look at segments by segment, nobody could explain during the EIS process how the Las Vegas line actually makes the Central Valley line work sooner than the LA connection does. So if we could figure out how to get around the very stringent Buy America requirements and get a train running between Victorville and Las Vegas, that gets you to the place where you can start talking about a really expensive tunnel underneath the Tehachapi's. And so what we need to do again is get to a point where we're thinking big picture enough that we can look at the pieces and figure out what we can do this year, next year, that year. But you got to start big in order to find the small. So this is up on the top is rail and feeder bus traffic county to county in California. That's today or recently. Down at the bottom is what the Chad thinks happens if they continue with business as usual and doing it piecemeal instead of this coordinated plan, right? This is what happens with the coordinated plan. You go from this to that. And now all of a sudden, you've got the volume where you can talk about having diners because you've got enough people cranking through that diner that you can have the logistics between that. Not that I really think diners are going to happen everywhere, but a lot of people in the railfan community want it. And that's in terms of total ridership. That's the difference between today and what happens with that business plan. That's huge. This is exciting. California really is driving the process. And we need to figure out how to replicate this step by step, state by state by state by state. The Northeast Corridor Futures proposal is very, very similar to this in offering and suggesting a different blend of services than what Amtrak envisions, and a very different way of using that infrastructure that really gets to a different way of serving markets today that aren't being served Either those people are taking a bus, they're driving, or they're not traveling. And the Northeast Corridor Futures is part of that planning process, right? And I skipped ahead a little bit. This is downtown Ciudad Real. And again, this is what we're working for. Instead of a town that was in decline, now with high-speed rail, you've got very vibrant downtown area. And that's really why we're here. It's not about the train. So we've got piecemeal of this. We've got a lot of green shoots getting started. Those blocks are areas what the FRA is trying to create a big picture view for a region. Hopefully those pieces become a nationwide program. Northeast Corridor Futures I talked about. Microsoft is really pushing for a new high-speed line between Seattle and Vancouver. Again, the numbers are daunting in terms of capital costs if you only look at that section. You need to think bigger in order to figure out how to use that more frequently. I'm really excited about the EIS that's for I-35. That's really exciting. Texas Central, let's get that constructed. And Brightline, and the one that's really interesting to me is the EIS. They've actually got an EIS out there, and an EIS is a basic framework for how you're going to build it. Atlanta and Chattanooga out in the southeast, to have that kind of progress there. Brightline is really, really important. They have a number of innovations in that service that are critical to our success. Even if you've got feeder trains, as you will in Dallas, that are coming hopefully from Tulsa and from Memphis and other places, from Meridian, and feeding into Dallas, and the people are walking from that train to the high-speed train to go to Houston, you're going to have freight railroad involvement. And we need a new structure for how the freight railroads become partners in this. And one of the things that people need is level boarding. So you can roll your suitcase, if you're able, onto the train, but more importantly, so you can push a stroller into the train where you can roll unassisted in your mobility device. It also helps dwell times, which is a critical part of end-to-end travel time, right? The way Brightline has done it will help the railroads. And the reason for that is they figured out a way to do level boarding and still have a freight train go by that platform. And that helps with dwell time. And an Amtrak train really screws up your main line if it's sitting there for 5 or 10 minutes loading passengers, blocking the main, because people have to go up that one step and then up the other steps, and you only have one door open, and if you have to have a ramp for a wheelchair, right? That's one of the things that Brightline has solved. It's how do you deal with freight trains going past 48-inch high platforms. They're doing train sets instead of individual cars. Train sets are safer, and they're more economical to run. The frequency on launch is critical. The partnership and figuring out how to do a real estate deal is part of it. And most importantly, what Brightline is paying the railroad, which unfortunately we don't know. But all of that together is something we've got to learn how to replicate around the country. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff. And I hope that here in Texas, you'll take the momentum you have between Texas Central and the I-35 corridor and start thinking about how to do that in a way that benefits the entire state with a mix of buses, local trains, etc. I was really happy. I had the pleasure of going to Grapevine today to see the construction of the station at Grapevine. That's really exciting to walk through the DMU there. Again, that train, it's a train set. It uses safer safety standards than what we have today in most of our trains here. It's going to be lower cost to operate, the operating pattern. You've got a lot of stuff here that builds up together. Let's think about a big vision and figure out, going back to those constituencies back at the beginning, you need to have a lobbyist, because a key part of making this work in the legislature is connecting everybody, connecting things, and providing that connection between this guy needs this information and that guy needs information. You really have to have somebody who's focused on it. You need to have a strong grassroots organization. And it's not just electronic. It's people going out to the rubber chicken circuit. It's people gathering letters from support, local electeds. It's having meetings of local electeds to bring them together so that they understand and keep them engaged. It's events, frequent events where the public can come. It's a lot of things together. And you need to be in constant coordination with the agencies so that everything lines up. You might not always agree with the agencies, but ultimately you're there to help them figure out how to get more money in their department and hire more people for that agency. So that's what we're working on. We want to, again, one thing. I've talked about rolling stock over and over again. In terms of urgency beyond this planning process, that's one thing we really need to hit over and over and over again this year is we've got to figure out how to replace the AM fleets, the superliners, and Horizons. We should not have cars that old out there running about, and certainly all of those P-42s. New trains would be safer. They would bring more revenue in. They would be more dependable. The challenge is Congress has to fund them. You can't do it on a business case. And that's something that we can engage people in now. So it's here and now. It's not just the vision we're talking about. We're talking about immediate next steps. So we should have a nationwide campaign that is saying over and over again to Congress, you need to figure out how to buy new trains. And not only just replace the existing fleet, but double the existing fleet. So that you can start talking about adding frequencies. You can start talking about adding new routes and all of that. And we can get the pipeline going instead of this, well, we'll buy a few trains here, we'll buy a few trains there, and you have to get a supply line chain going in order for that. And then you run it for a couple of years, you shut it down, the supply chain goes away, and then you start it back up again. That doesn't work. You have to figure out how you have a constant plan where you're constantly buying trains throughout the process. And that's one of the tricks in Japan is they're constantly replacing their fleet. And you wouldn't on it so that the factories are constantly running. So that's the immediate agenda item for us this year. And if you're on our email list, you've seen us talk about this, one of our themes, new rolling stock, let's replace the rolling stock. And we've got 4 cases that really bring a lot of innovation into the marketplace and take us far beyond what's in the superliners. And here are those 4. We've talked about the Talgo and the ability to get around curves much faster and a much lighter weight train. The Siemens train, which has brought a lot of innovation into it in terms of the train set, the level boarding, how to do a much better train on the existing safety standards. You've got the huge innovation that's coming and bringing European designs in the Acela and the Stadler cars. And if you haven't seen them, those are the interiors of the Brightliners. And so I have repeated it over and over again, and I skipped over Crossrail because that's something specific to Chicago. But those are our 3 immediate goals. Figure out how to get this plan going. We want to get the process started. Figuring out how to solve the access problem to Chicago, and immediately getting an order for new trains. So you can join us at midwesthsr.org. We have a weekly newsletter. We've been a little bit silent on our action campaigns. We've been retooling our messaging, and we're bringing that all back in the next month or so. And ride the trains that we've got today as much as you can and get other people to ride trains. And call often to your congressman. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to ask them. Yes, sir.
Some public agencies Thank you. Um, so let me make a couple of comments. First of all, unfortunately, high-speed rail and rail passenger service is too much a blue state, red state issue. I'm from one of the blue states. We now have a Democratic governor in Virginia who sees the vision. But why in Ohio? Why in Texas? Why in Indiana? And incidentally, I represent the guy who tried to operate the Hoosier state on a private basis. I know that story. Why are these predominantly Republican governors against funding for high-speed rail or any sort of public transit? I'd like to find out that answer. That's the first point. Second, in terms of freight rail, I think it's more than just compensation. And frankly, a well-run Amtrak would have no problem at all paying the type of trackage rights fees that freight railroads really need. The problem is that Amtrak doesn't have enough equipment. They don't sell their services. In some cases, the prices are too high. The fares in the Northeast are probably twice per mile what they are in the Midwest, and that's on the regional train. The other issues for freight railroads are liability and insurance, and until those problems are solved, you probably will never get the freight railroads to enthusiastically embrace passenger trains. So those are a couple of points, but I agree with 95% of what you said.
So, I joke, but you know, if you have people together who are coming together for a period of time, you might have them talk to each other, and they might start to get political ideas, right? And one of those ideas might involve communism. And you know, we absolutely cannot have communism in this country, and therefore we can't allow people to meet each other at a point where they will actually talk to each other. I joke, but there's a part of that. There's a little bit of fear of communism because socialist or communist countries are the ones you always bring up about high-speed rail. You know, there's other factors like that. But I think as rail advocates, we've actually contributed to the problem in a big way by saying high-speed rail is to connect big cities. Well, high-speed rail doesn't just connect big cities. But because we've had this inferiority complex of this system fell apart and we need to do something completely different. And so that completely different is it has to serve big cities. And you have to have big volumes of big cities in order to make high-speed rail work. Well, that's not true, right? Trains have a huge advantage in that they can go fast right into the middle of your town, no matter how big that town is. They can pull into that train station and they can hit the town border going 80 or 90 miles an hour, stop in the middle of town, be there for 2 minutes, and get out of town. A bus can't do that. And so trains really are a rural amenity. They are really, can be, if designed properly, a huge service for rural areas. But they have to run more than one time a day. And they can't run in the middle of the night only, right? And they have to be on time, and they still have to be fast. Even though that train may go from Chicago to LA, it's still got to go fast from Topeka to Kansas City. And we've never really, as advocates, gone into rural areas and explained why high-speed rail will work. And I get so angry when I hear so many people talking about we need to find those big city pairs. And I'm a little aggravated with the way the FRA is structuring their plans region to region to region with hubs. Instead of thinking about the network that where did the interstate highway system start? The Bureau of Public Roads and the Department of Agriculture was the one who designed the interstate highway system before there was a US DOT. It came out of the rural areas. And that's what we need to do. We need to go to rural areas. And those The rural areas are where they're hurting the most from our bad transportation system. They don't quite see it, but they'll see it the next time gas goes to $4. They'll stop going to the doctor again, and they'll stop being able to get to work. That's the answer to that question. The railroad issue is very complicated, and it would take another, it's one that I'm just starting the process of thinking. Any other questions? Yes.
I've noticed that a number of these projects, when it comes to the actual planning of the route in the EISs, tend to get bogged down in the question of should the endpoint stations go to the center of the city or should they go to an airport located more remotely. I think that's specifically been an issue for Texas Central and the Front Range. So do you have any data compiled to show which of those options, when they're not both possible, actually brings in more riders?
So there is a perception that there's a lot of people at airports, and that there's a lot of volume there, right? And people go to the airport, and they're used to going to the airport. But if you look, take buildings as a physical graph of where people are, and where you want to be is where people are, and where are the tallest buildings, that's where you want to be. And then you want to have transit systems that connect in. So if you have to choose between one and the other, I would always say downtown. And most people wouldn't say that because they're used to going to the airport. They're not used to going downtown. Another advantage of trains is in many cases, the same train can do both. And that train from Venice is a perfect example of that. There are cases where I would go the other way. Madison, Wisconsin is one of those. Decatur is another. Illinois, where I would say it really needs to be at the airport because you can't get the tracks downtown. And no, there is no real data, but I mean, it seems apparent to me, especially since you need to figure out an airplane. Again, think about how big an airplane is. It's small. A train's really big. You've got to have a lot of people walking to get to start filling that train up. So I'm sorry I don't have specific. Any more? Excellent. Thank you. So